So the average house price as of Q1 2025 is $503K. Think about that. It is literally $500,000 for the average house price in the United States. And so that has the question, is that ever going to come down? Is there ever going to be a housing market crash? You know, that's kind of the interesting thing that I've thought about myself for a while over the last 5 years. And there's no shortage of dipshits like Reviture coping. I call them Reviture coping because they've been saying there's going to be a housing market crash since 2021 and house prices were going through the roof over the last 4 years. But I wanted to make this video to talk about the possibility of home prices going down is because that seems to be a hot topic along with grocery prices and about anything else. Recently, there's been some discussion about an impending recession. They're talking about bond yields inverting. You know, that was something that was signaled in 2008. And so, you know, people are asking if there's going to be a recession. Now, I've heard a lot of stupid comments from people, not just, you know, people in my immediate family, but also friends saying that we're already in a recession. We've been in a recession for the last 5 years. And I want to debunk some normie takes on what a recession is, okay? Just because you are struggling does not necessarily mean that you're in a recession. That's not what a recession is. We have to look at actual analytics and terms on what that actually means economically, as opposed to saying whether or not your quality of living is good. That has nothing to do whether or not there's a boom or a bust cycle. That has nothing to do whether or not you, as an individual, or even as a group of people, are doing well. And I want to give you an example, okay? In the 1920s, it was known as the Gilded Age for a reason, is because, you know, the asset class was actually doing quite well. The thing is they had a tremendous amount of wealth inequality, and that's where the term gilded comes from, because gilded in gold, it was only on a superficial level, you know, wealthy off. And we're in a similar situation right now, where you're hearing the asset class, so our assets are going through the roof, and everybody who owns things are making a lot of money. But, you know, you and I, you know, as average wage workers, you know, who don't own things, I own maybe my car, and that's about it. You know, we're struggling. You know, prices are going up, right? Then you might say, that's evidence of a recession. No, just because prices are going up doesn't mean it's a recession, economically speaking, right? You know, GDP is something that is going up, and you could say that's caused by inflation, and I don't really trust the economists and their metrics, but I do want to give you an example. Just because something is economically doing well and GDP is going up does not necessarily mean your standard of living is going up, okay? You know, the metric I have used on this channel and anything I've ever talked about is, you know, to determine how you are doing good as an individual, as a worker, is, are you working harder for less, or are you working less for more? If you're working less for more, I would say that's a good metric, right? Is because everybody likes the idea of getting more stuff for working less. That's what it comes down to, right? If income inflated as much as prices did, you wouldn't have a problem with it. If income, you know, deflated as much as prices did, so say prices go down and incomes go down at the same rate, you still wouldn't have a problem, is because you neither won nor lost anything from that situation. You don't have a problem with inflation as an individual. What you're upset about is that incomes haven't caught up with inflation. Now, that gets us back into the topic on what this sorts of stuff was. Just because the numbers are going up, you know, and that's technically, economically speaking, a boom on paper, and people are doing good, specifically asset class, because if you own a bunch of assets, like houses, for instance, and those are continuously going up, yeah, you're actually doing really well. If you bought a house for $250K and then a couple of years later it was $400K, you've just made $150K in wealth. And then everybody else who doesn't own an asset, you know, they're screwed over, like myself and many others of the younger generations. Okay? So, you know, as much as someone would like to say we already are in a recession, that's not what a recession is. Let's talk about what a recession is so we can understand what it is in nature, okay? Why, funny enough, right? You know, why some people celebrate a depression, including myself, is it benefits people who are not a part of the asset class. Young workers, young people, you know, who have no assets, who are making very low money, right? It benefits them for prices of assets to go down so they can start to jump into the market and accumulate wealth. And housing is typically the cornerstone of the American who stores wealth through owning a home. Obviously, that's becoming further and further out of reach. We can talk about the World Economic Forum turning everyone into a perpetual renter, but that's not the topic of the video. The topic of the video is to talk about whether or not we're going to have a recession and whether or not, you know, housing is going to become affordable over that sorts of stuff. Okay? Now that we can understand what a recession is, prices may go down. Okay, now let me tell you how a recession also screws over workers as well, right? Because everyone's talking about how inflation is toasting everybody is because incomes are not catching up with inflation, okay? And it almost seems like some people would be under the illusion that a depression or a recession like 2008, where prices collapse down, is a good thing as well. Now, here's the thing, okay? This is how the ruling class screws over ordinary people in both situations, whether it be an economic boom or an economic recession. In an economic recession, you also have historically high unemployment rates. And the thing is that when nobody has an income to actually buy anything, it doesn't matter if things are cheap. You don't have a job, so you can't actually pay for anything, and you're living with your parents. So that's how you lose out in a recession as well. Now, recessions may be overdue. The United States has been overdue for a recession for quite some time at this point. Most people assumed it would happen around 2018 or 2019. People assumed COVID was going to pop the bubble, but then they overstimulated the economy by pumping a bunch of money into the economy. They dumped a ton of liquidity into the actual economy, okay? Now, we're going to be talking about the housing market. Is the recession going to make things cheaper for the housing market? Well, we don't know, okay? So here's some speculative, you have to understand, right? Because it all goes down to supply and demand at the end of the day, okay? If there's ever a time where there's a greater supply of houses than there are people demanding it, then yes, prices will go down, okay? In the case of 2008, people assumed housing was going to go to the moon, and they built a whole bunch of properties, and, on top of that, people just assumed this asset would continuously grow forever, and it didn't. Eventually, it slipped a little bit. A lot of people ended up underwater, where their houses were now worth less than what they took a loan out to purchase it for. They had ninja loans. They didn't have much equity built up, so then they had to either mass sell off, or they basically got foreclosed on. So when everybody tries to sell their house at the same time, that's a situation that is oversupplied, okay? Now, when there's not enough buyers, okay? Combined with unemployment, if there is not enough people who have an income to actually qualify for a home, then they can't buy it, okay? And so thus demand goes down. Now, what kind of situation do we exist in the United States right now? We all know prices are out of control. That's no hidden secret, okay? And so the thing about that is that here's the thing. There's one condition. There's two ways this could possibly end with the housing market, whether it continues to retain its value or it's not, okay? And it all goes down to the existing buyer base and whether or not, demand keeps up, okay? And so, for instance, if the existing group of people who own homes right now, and there's a good point that this might be the case, okay, is that if the vast majority of homeowners, have a ton of equity built up and they have historically low interest rates, they have literally no reason in the world to ever sell their home. That's just a cruel reality. And Revature Coping, that YouTube channel, as much as people would love to cope about the housing market going crash, that is one thing that is a possibility, is that, they have a ton of equity built up and they have historically low interest rates and they are never going to sell, okay? If you had a mortgage payment that was $1,000 a month for a property that's now worth $500,000, would you ever sell that thing? To just buy into the same market that, that you just sold out of, right? No. You would never sell your house if you had less than $1,000 a month in a mortgage payments, and now the property is now worth $500K. You never would. Let's be honest here, okay? Because there's no morality in this. People are just serving their own self-interest. Now, the other possibility for the housing market is because we all know that the World Economic Forum said 5 years ago that you will own nothing and you will rent everything, okay? And that mentality has been right for the last 5 years. I remember arguing with a fuckwit back in 2021. He said, well, you're always going to need a place to live, and housing and real estate is where the true investment goes, is because there's limited supply. And that's a very strong point. He's absolutely right. You always need a place to live. And so I talked to him. There's only one condition where your hypothesis doesn't hold up, that you can't think that you're going to ever, you could just continuously buy assets and stretch your equity to, make an eternal revenue stream of rent, okay? If there's ever a situation where there's mass unemployment and people cannot pay their rent, you are not going to be able to pay your mortgage, and you're going to end up having to sell your properties, or get foreclosed on. That's the unfortunate reality. And so, the other possibility on how the housing crisis is going to get resolved is because they've been doing a ton of new constructions. In fact, we have an oversupply of houses right now. I've been checking the statistics. I'd have to bring that up. And on top of that, everybody and their mother wants to be a landlord because they don't want to be a part of the propertyless class, and thus leaving the younger generation screwed. I hate to break it to you, but Gen Alpha is tiny. Millennials are not having kids. That includes me. I'm not going to have kids. Me and my wife don't want to have fucking kids in this economy. That sounds terrible. Okay? And so why would anybody want to have kids? So that pool of demand is getting smaller and smaller. So, possibility number 2 on whether or not the property market is going to collapse, okay? And it goes down to the fact that if they've ever built more properties than there are people to actually rent from them, and they've over leveraged themselves, there's a good chance that you're going to have a panic sell off of landlords selling their properties, because they can't actually get them filled up because there are not enough tenants to go around to make these people have a decent income stream. Is because, again, there's a lot of people like the jackass I was talking back in 21 who says, well, you're always going to need a place to live. Well, that's true. Everybody's always going to need a place to live, but they might or might not have money in their pocket if they don't have a fucking job. Okay, now let's talk about it. Number 2, on why there might actually be a recession coming up. And this is what I think is the greatest indicator why we're going to be entering into an economic recession. And it has everything to do with liquidity. Back in 2020 and 2021, you saw a mass injection of liquidity through the stimulus checks and a bunch of other places. What are the conditions that trigger a recession? Okay, it's the lack of liquidity. You might have heard that in a recession, cash is king. Why does that happen? Okay, I had come across a video from Deconstructing Narcissism where he started talking about Klarna being used to put groceries on payment plans, and it was absolutely baffling to me. I have not lied to you before. Me and my partner have been spending the vast majority of our income towards rent and groceries, is because that's how shitty the economy is. Now, as an engineer, I'm a little bit better off. We're a little bit better off than most people, and so we can't imagine how awful it must be for everybody else. I heard about the idea that people are using Klarna to finance food and groceries on a payment plan, I was just kind of baffled, okay? And so here's the other possibility of why we might entering into a recession, okay? Now, how a recession works out is that you have a liquidity crisis. And the thing is, some people would call it a crisis of overproduction. If there's ever a point where there's not enough liquidity flowing around and companies cannot turn a profit, you know what happens when companies can't turn a profit? They start laying people off, and people who are laid off don't have an income. And if they don't have an income, they have no buying power. And essentially, you have a cyclical feedback within the economy where companies can't turn a profit, so they lay people off, unemployment goes up, there's less buying power, and there's less demand, and you essentially enter into a recession is because there's no liquidity, okay? Cash is king in a recession if you want to survive a recession. Save up as much liquid cash that you could possibly send, maybe gold, whatever you can, right? Because when that happens, prices will drop and things will be incredibly cheap to buy. And the reason I think we're going to be entering into a recession is because if people are putting their fucking groceries on a payment plan and financing it through Klarna, okay, that's a big indicator that there's a lack of liquidity, okay? And it seems to me that, and I've seen no shortage of people talking about how people are overstretching their credit ever since the start of the pandemic. If we ever run out of credit and that debt gets called back and people can no longer finance the things that they need to do and companies can't turn a profit, and I think we're reaching that tipping point. Companies are not going to be able to reach that. They're going to start laying people off. And then that's when the cyclical feedback begins. You don't have enough liquidity going around, so people can't buy anything. Just because, unironically, people have been stretched to their limits. There's a liquidity crisis. There's not cash flowing. So if there's no cash flowing, people can't buy things. And if people can't buy things, companies can't turn a profit. And that's when the layoffs begin. And we start getting into the cyclical feedback of where nobody has any buying power. And so companies have to slash their prices. With these people being laid off, this could lead into the triggering condition because I've seen they've been building a ton of apartment complexes, a ton of houses, and they're all being used for rental properties. If they cannot fill these slots and they're over leveraged on these properties, they have no equity to burn through, they're going to be forced to mass sell off these properties. Now, here's the thing. I said earlier, cash is king in a recession. I meant every word that I said, right? Now, here's the thing, okay? This is how the rich screw over the poor, even in a recession, is because most of you fuckers are not going to have a job to sit on to actually have an income to afford the things that are at discounted prices because of the recession, okay? And that's why I say, if you can, save up as much cash as you can, live as minimalistic as possible, and crash this economy, is because it's in your interest for the asset class to lose something out. Hoard up the cash, stop spending liquidity, and make cash scarce. That being said, that is what I think are the two possible outcomes for the housing market. If we enter in a recession and they're over leveraged on rental properties, then there's a good chance that housing will be affordable. Now, the catch is, because just like there's a catch that right now we're doing good economically on paper, as they say in every bubble, okay, is that, you have to have a job to afford these things in the first place. In the Great Depression, nobody had no money to buy anything in the first place. That's why they did all that government spending to stimulate the economy. That's just how it works. The lack of liquidity leads to a recession. And to be fair, the United States has been overdue for a recession for 7 years, in my honest opinion. Recessions and depressions usually happen once every 10 years. And I have a very sneaking suspicion this is going to be a very nasty depression, in my honest opinion. I think this is going to be terrible. So, if you can try and hold on to your job, I think that would be a good thing. Try and stay where you're at. Try and save as much money as possible and keep liquid cash, because if there's an economic downturn, you're gonna wanna save up money as much as possible. It's because, again, cash is king in a recession. Jobs are hard to find. There's not a lot of liquidity, and so everything goes down in price. So, with that being said, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think we're going to enter a recession? Do you think the housing market is going to burst, or is this not a bubble? It's more like a dome, and so there's a ton of people with a ton of equity built into their properties, and so they're just going to do that. What do you think is the future of real estate in the United States? Do you think people are ever going to afford their homes again, or do you think the World Economic Forum has won? Is there going to be a housing market crash? Hope or cope? Leave a comment in the comment section. If you like this video, like, share, and subscribe to the video. I hope to see you in the next video. You all have a good day.